Good evening, good evening. I hope you all have sympathy now with those of us who actually live here and have to get somewhere on a Friday afternoon. And congratulations all for making it here to this splendid event. My name is David Bomford. I'm the Associate Director for Collections of the Getty Museum. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all, the Renaissance Society of America, for this lecture, the Josephine Waters Bennett Lecture. And I welcome you on behalf of the Getty Museum and the Getty Research Institute and their directors, Michael Brand and Thomas Gatkins. It's a very great thing that we can hold this lecture at the Getty Villa. And I hope that those of you who are visiting it for the first time will enjoy looking around the rooms, which will be open in the reception afterwards, and enjoy what we think is one of the most beautiful antiquities museums in the world. I have to say one or two words of thanks to John Monfazani and to Bill Kennedy, who will be speaking after me. And also I have to make one or two housekeeping announcements, which are routine at the Getty Villa, and that is to remind you that there are emergency exits here. We're in earthquake territory, and there are two at the back and one at the front. I don't wish to alarm you or anything. And I would also normally ask you to turn off your mobile phones, but since there's no reception here at the villa, but hey, turn them off anyway. It's a very great pleasure now to introduce Bill Kennedy, who is president of the Renaissance Society of America, who will say a few words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I've visited this site many, many times, but always as a tourist. As a literary historian, I never had a real reason to work in the art museum here or do any specialized work. And I suppose the majority of my colleagues in the RSA are likewise literary historians, social historians, cultural historians, political historians, economic historians, and so forth. And we've always envied the art historians who can really do work here over the time. So in my visits, simply as a tourist, but always as a very appreciative tourist, and now as a very appreciative guest of the Foundation, I want to extend on behalf of the Renaissance Society of America our deep thanks for all that you've done to enable this. In particular, I want to thank David Bromford, our immediate host, and his expert staff, and especially Gail Feigenbaum and Karen Stokes for making this possible. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the current Vice President of the Renaissance Society of America, my successor next year, Elizabeth Cropper.
Thank you very much, David and Bill. I turned off my cell phone, but I also turned off my voice. So I hope I can manage to introduce David with the correct eloquence that is his due. It's really an honor and a pleasure to introduce my colleague, David Freedberg, this year's Josephine Waters Bennett Lecturer at the Renaissance Society. Tonight sponsored by the Getty Villa, Malibu, in this wonderful Pompeian fantasy. On behalf of the Society, I too want to thank the Getty Museum and the Getty Research Institute for their hospitality, and also our colleagues here in California, many of them at UCLA, who've worked so hard to bring this very special meeting about. But to turn now to David Freedberg, who came to Columbia University from South Africa by way of a BA in Classics at Yale, a DPhil at Oxford, which was on iconoclasm and painting in the revolt of the Netherlands 1566 to 1609. So I think David almost qualifies for the Renaissance from the beginning. That PhD was produced actually at a time when the history of art at Oxford was still not quite fully accepted. David taught at Westfield College, University of London, and at the Courtauld Institute before making a momentous leap back to the United States in 1984 to Barnard College and thence to Columbia, where he's currently the Pierre Matisse Professor of the History of Art. From 1996 to 98, he was Andrew W. Mellon Professor at my own institution, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. Since 2000, Professor Freedberg has been the director of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America. And this year, he serves as the Rudolf Bitkover Professor at the Bibliotheca Hertziana Max Planck Institute in Rome, and will soon be taking up a fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. Now something about the work, and not only about the play of David's scholarly life. There is a consistency in David Freedberg's work that I think is noteworthy. From his earliest publications, beginning with the volume with the most extraordinary title of The Life of Christ After the Passion, David was interested in the peculiar power of images to convey the impossible, to arouse deep passion among iconoclasts, and ultimately to appeal to neurological responses that affect the brain itself. His book, The Power of Images, published in 1989 by Chicago University Press, first brought these themes together. In his volumes for the Cassiano dal Pozzo project, Freedberg devoted himself to the paper museum that set out in 17th century Rome to record all the sorts of objects that we now see around us in the natural and artificial world of the Getty Villa. But it was in his 2002 study, The Eye of the Lynx, Art, Science, and Nature in the Age of Galileo, again published by Chicago, that Freedberg began to weave together a story that was about sociability and perception as much as it was about discovery and invention. In this Galileo year, we might stop there, but I think it important to underline the new work that David Freedberg has embarked upon in areas of anthropology and neurology, with essays on such topics as empatia, movimento ed emozione, art, imagination, and reality, the cortical motor works, and lectures on the body in motion, art, anthropology, and neuroscience, not to mention a conference in his own institute quite recently on art and the new biology of the mind. David Freedberg's ideas are by no means universally embraced, and sometimes they're as iconoclastic as the topic he first studied. But wherever he is, whatever he talks about, he persists imposing important challenges, worrying now about neurosystems and empathy, even as he continues to classify bees and beetles. He will lecture tonight on movement and morality in the Renaissance, so please join me in welcoming David Freedberg as this year's Bennett lecturer. Thank you.
I would have hugged Elizabeth for that introduction, but she warned me not to, I think only on the grounds of a cold. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, David Bomford. Thank you, Bill Kennedy. And above all, I want to thank all of you for being here this evening after what no doubt has been a demanding day and perhaps a pleasurable day, but no doubt a long one, of other lectures. So I'm grateful sort of proleptically for your patience. I'm also very honored to be able to give this lecture here at the Getty Center at the newly restored villa, which I haven't visited for many years, certainly not before the splendid renovation, which I recall visiting a long, long time ago with Francis Watson and Francis Haskell sitting on the grass above the villa and having tea on the lawns. I suppose only Englishmen could have done that together. So the title that you have for this lecture this evening is a little larger than I intended. For the most part, what I want to talk about this evening will be about the Quattrocento and about late Quattrocento painting in particular. But its implications extend well beyond that, as I hope will be clear. My abstract, for those of you who've looked at it, written as always before I wrote my paper, offers only a partial guide to what I will have to say now. Do I need to switch this thing on, or can you? The relationship between art and morality in the Renaissance is not exhausted by the usual three culprits: suspicion of the body, infringements of decorum, and notions of the vanity of art. The most obvious examples are provided by the criticism of Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, Leonardo's views on decorum, and Savonarola's violent reactions to painting and sculpture. Of course, there's a fourth issue too, that of Plato's denunciation of mimesis in the 10th book of the Republic. Painting, like the other imitative arts, could only represent appearances, not the true ideas that lay behind them. At best, which wasn't too good to begin with, artists could only produce eikones, more or less accurate reproductions of sensible appearance. At worst, which was most of the time, they distorted appearance by devices like perspective, foreshortening, and so on, and thus produces phantasmata or idola, deceptive approximations to reality, one stage further removed from idea. This is the critique that runs through all moral reservations about imitation, from Plato and the Neoplatonists up until Deleuze and Baudrillard. But the issue of movement, and in particular the relationship between movement and morality, barely features in it at all. This evening, I will have recourse to names and ideas that will be familiar to most of you. Nothing, for example, could be more central to the work of Marsilio Ficino than movement, and yet, despite the many discussions of his influence, this aspect of his philosophy has almost never been connected with art. And while everyone now knows of A.B. Warburg's concerns with the emotional dimensions of movement, he left its moral implications inexplicit. As always, one of the great pleasures of this conference, the Renaissance Society of America's conference, has been the recovery of new and forgotten names. So I hope that you will pardon me this evening if I go against one of my own most cherished principles and stay with well-known ones. I do so in the hope of presenting what seems to me to be a central issue in the understanding of the still incompletely examined relationship between Renaissance art and morality. In order to introduce some of the more complex issues at stake, let me return to the three main culprits I mentioned before: suspicion of the body, infringements of decorum, and the alleged vanity of art. In the case of the Sistine Chapel, the objections were not only to Michelangelo's apparent deviations from the sacred text, but above all to the ways in which he represented bodies in that sacred place. First, because of their nudity and alleged indecency, and secondly, because in the exaggerated depiction of musculature and twisting mobile forms, too much attention was drawn to the artifice. So you've been looking at obscure things all day, many of you at emblems, and I'm going to show you the obvious illustrations. This allegedly distracted beholders from the essential incorporeality of the sacred. It's easy enough to understand this the moment you set foot in the Sistine Chapel. But for the time being, let me remind you of the long-standing notion that it is precisely movement that gives life and vitality to the body, of course, as Michelangelo well understood, that animates it, whether in life or in representation. It gives soul, as we would say, to the body and life to the soul. If Ficino was the great Neoplatonic exponent of this view, then Leonardo, my second obvious example, was the best-known artistic theorist of this position in the Renaissance. For him, as for Alberti before him, painting moves the senses more rapidly than poetry, precisely because the eyes convey a sense of the reality of the body better than the ears, and because movement animates the painted body with a sense of life. Since the impression of movement is essential to the powers of painting, it is also the source of abuse. After all, it may move the beholder to responses that infringe the limits of decorum. As Adam Smith would later put it eloquently in the first part of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, entitled, the first part was entitled Of the Propriety or Impropriety of Actions, he said, in the suitableness or unsuitableness, in the proportion or disproportion which the affection seems to bear to the cause or object which excites it, consists the propriety or impropriety, the decency or ungracefulness of the consequent action. The very same words might have been used by Leonardo. As he was all too well aware, every insistence on the mastery of movement is implicit with the possibility of infringing of the bounds of propriety. The painter has to know exactly how to depict movements, and yet, in using his anatomical skills and his knowledge of the science of motion, so central, as we all know, to Leonardo, he may go too far. It's true, and I quote, most of you know this passage, that one has to observe decorum, that is, that the movements are those that announce the movement of the soul of the mover. For example, if one has to represent someone who has to display a timorous reverence, it should not be done with such audacity and presumption that this effect seems desperation. As I saw in these days an angel who appeared in his Annunciating to want to chase Our Lady from her chamber, with movements that suggested the sort of affront that one would wish to make to the most despicable enemy. And Our Lady appeared as if she wanted to throw herself out of the window in desperation. So remember not to make such mistakes. As has been pointed out more than once before, this passage seems to apply almost perfectly to Botticelli's late Annunciation from Cestello in the Uffizi, as it does to other works of Botticelli as well. But rather than the issue of decorum, what I want to emphasize here is the clear relationship between outward movement and the movement of the soul. It is this relation that both Leonardo and Alberti before him emphasize when they urge that the painter know precisely how to paint the body and its muscles. So the famous passage, moverà l'istoria l'anima quando gli uomini ivi dipinti molti porgeranno suo proprio movimento d'anima, ma questi movimenti d'anima, these movements of the soul, one knows from the movements of the body. This is the most succinct of the several Albertian passages that lie at the basis of A.B. Warburg's famous notion of the pathos formal, along with its development in Botticelli. For Warburg, of course, it was the movement of Botticelli's figures, above all the movement of the bodies clothed in flying draperies, that conveyed their inner psychological states. My third example of the more obvious aspects of the relations between art and morality in the Renaissance, and in some ways the simplest one, is that of Savonarola. Everyone knows something about the two bonfires of the Vanities on Carnival 1497 and 1498. But his objection to paintings had not only to do with their vanity and their expense. His concern was also about the ways in which art could be invested, often through movement, with inappropriate sensuality. Hence his ambivalent approach to dance. In its more vital and sensual forms, it had to be controlled, but it also served to bind together his followers in harmony and solidarity. In this dialectic, as we shall see, he was by no means alone. For several years now, I have been interested not just in the problem of the representation of movement in images, but also in the ways in which spectators' bodies react to the sight of the representation of movement and of the emotional and empathetic consequences of that engagement. My current work, as Elizabeth mentioned, is about the neural substrate of the felt imitation of the movements of others, especially of represented others, and of the emotional correlates of such movements. Alberti's and Leonardo's sense of the effectiveness of the body in movement, both physiologically and psychologically, presumably rested on some kind of inchoate theory of felt imitation, of a kind that would only receive fuller development in the 19th century in the work of Fischer and Lips. So take Botticelli, for example. To look at the picture of the Annunciation that you see before you is to have a strong sense of corporeal involvement with the movements of its figures. It is as if one feels one's own muscles are activated in the way both the angels and the virgins are, as if one feels a kind of incipient sway of one's own torso as the Virgin recoils from the forward rush of the angel. Perhaps you will think I exaggerate, and I'm very aware that some of you may stubbornly say I don't feel these things at all, and if we could let you have a TMS or some of the other experiments I'm doing in the neurosciences, you would see that you would not recognize what you are feeling. But that's not what I'm talking today. I want you to consider instead the case of the Cioni Pietà in the Pol di Pezzoli in Milan. It would be hard to deny, I think, the sensation one has of moving one's hand in almost the same way as Nicodemus does as he raises the crown of thorns and nails towards heaven in anguish, or of one's felt emulation of the gesture of the Mary who covers her face, you see on the left, who covers her face with her hands, of the Magdalene's action in tenderly embracing Christ's feet, of the cradling of Christ's head, and so on, or even, I think, the twist in one's neck as one gazes upon the awkwardly collapsed head of the Virgin against the shoulder of the evangelist. Once thus primed, one seems almost automatically to feel a kind of rushing forward in an activation of the leg muscles, in looking at the frightened figures of the damned in the circle of hell in one of the few colored illustrations of Botticelli's illustrations for the Divine Comedy. These kinds of claims were already made by the 19th century empathy theorist, and to some extent, of course, you will all remember in what I once thought were the rather sentimental writings of Bernard Berenson. But what we now have, as I've just implied, are the testable neural bases for such responses, which I'm not going to discuss. Rather, I want to consider some of the historical views of how movement activates the body's potential in such a way that makes it susceptible to moralization. In doing so, I hope to go beyond the obvious and simple issue of prescriptions on sensuality or the need for propriety and decorum. In referring to felt spectatorial involvement in the implied movements of a work of art, I mean to go well beyond Warburg's pathos formel, even though the Warburgian notions of inner emotion expressed by outward movement could hardly be more relevant here. Warburg spoke of the figures in the picture. I am concerned with the empathetic engagement provoked by such figures, with the ways in which the painter, consciously or unconsciously, elicits similar stirrings on the parts of the beholder. It's all too clear that precisely these aspects of Botticelli's figures were anticipated by Donatello, or rather that he too, like Botticelli later on, seems to have had some sense of the ways in which the sight of movement could activate the body in such a way that the appropriate emotions might be generated. Who does not feel an emulatory sense of movement in looking at the dancing putti on the Florentine Cantoria, it may be clear in the black and white, or on the Prato pulpit? I show you some details. 15th and 16th century viewers would have been at least as sensitive to such movements as we think we are now. It is perhaps these figures that Warburg should have begun by citing, rather than Alberti's texts on movements and the Maenad-like figures of Botticelli. In his excellent book on the Renaissance Putto, Charles Dempsey showed how Donatello restored a source of vigorous movement to the classical and medieval ornamental Putto. They were relatively immobile. His, as Dempsey put it, were ornament in action. One has only to compare Donatello's putti with the static infants on Della Quercia's tomb of Ilara del Carretto, you remember 1410, to have a sense of Donatello's achievement. Dempsey also, and perhaps more importantly, outlined the Aristotelian and Galenic theory that underlies the ways in which his spiritelli were believed to be endowed with life. It is a theory that strikingly anticipates contemporary views of the relationship between movement and emotion. So, in speaking of the putti that seemed to teeter at the top of the Cavalcanti altar of around 1430, it may be better in these images. Vasari observed how, for fear of height, per paura dell'altezza, one putto clutches the other in his embrace as if to reassure him. Looking at these figures, spectators may well feel a kind of vicarious precariousness in their own bones, and it is this that allows spectators to identify, as Vasari also noted, with a virgin's reactions to the arrival of the angel too. As Dempsey wrote, the sudden rush of fright that has momentarily shocked her, causing her to start back, is acted out by the infants, as you can see on the frame above her, who mischievously push each other to the brink. They mirror the surging spirit of fear that has momentarily taken hold of her, and they communicate it viscerally to the viewer, who looks with alarm at small infants giddily trying to balance themselves many meters above the floor. They're very high up there, and they do look as if they're going to teeter off. It's precisely this visceral sense of movement that lies at the basis of that long-standing Aristotelian view on the ways in which spiritus or pneuma animates the bodies of both angels and humans. These spirits constitute an active force, a virtu attiva, that produce both good and bad effects in the body. They can be both celestial and infernal. They generate automatic responses of a kind, that I quote Dempsey again, that seem to invade the body unbidden, impelling responses not produced by an act of reason or the will. They stir the soul. So this is a remarkable passage in the light of the notion of automaticity, which scientists only now are beginning to grapple with. So these responses stir the soul, or these spiritus, they stir the soul, they make the heart beat faster and cause involuntary responses of a kind that we are only now beginning to understand better. They are responsible for the whole gamut of emotional responses via the body, from a sense of blessed happiness and vitality to the gamut of negative passions, from fear and terror to desire and promiscuity. As Ficino would soon put it, passion in bodies cannot exist apart from movement and action. Donatello's revival of the ancient Putto in these active forms make clear that the movement of the body entails both negative and positive outcomes, and it is from this, as we shall see, that all moral choice follows. This dialectic, and I think if Chris or Gus, if we could have the lights on, so we're not going to have images for a while. The house lights up, please. This dialectic appears with no greater force than in Ficino's Theologica Platonica. Platonist though he is, the issue of mimesis and Plato's stern reservations about it barely feature in Ficino's work. What concerns Ficino above all is the problem of movement and its relationship with its opposite, stability. A quote from the first part of chapter 4. In its substance, rational soul is motionless. This is a very typical passage. In its substance, rational soul is motionless. In its activity, it is mobile. In its power, it is partly motionless and partly mobile. Like the famous image of the charioteer in the Phaedrus, Ficino's commentary on that dialogue is full of the juxtaposition of the positive aspects of movement with its negative consequences. The need for anima provided by movement is balanced by the requirement of stability and the associated benefits of tranquility and physical and psychical serenity, of soul abstracted from body. As Christella remarked, for Ficino, the ideal space for contemplation, the only source for the moral life, is provided by the withdrawal of the soul from the body. Ficino's entire oeuvre, from the great expanse of the Platonic theology to the lyrical pages of the Convito, is suffused with the problem of this dichotomy. Indeed, it is this that lies at the core of his work, and in which the redemption of painting, and perhaps the other mimetic arts too, is to be found. Yet it has been almost entirely omitted in discussions of his influence on Botticelli and on Quattrocento art more generally. For example, in their delight at discovering the one Ficinian passage that clearly refers to the visual arts, the description of Apelles painting a field in Book 3 of the Platonic Theology, both Gombrich and André Chastel fail to discuss what really lies behind it. So I'm going to give you another image that will be away from, or perhaps not so far away from, the emblematic material you've digested today. Lights down, please. House lights down. So Chastel and Gombrich are so excited by what seems like a rather vague resemblance to the Primavera that they miss its point, the point of the passage, which I'll cite in a moment. Gombrich even went so far as to refer to this passage as, I quote, an unexpected glimpse of a Quattrocento painter at work, which it certainly is not. Rather, Ficino is desperately trying to clarify the dilemma he has caused for himself, namely, so I'll get to the passage in a moment, but I'm giving you the background to it. He's desperately trying to clarify the dilemma he has caused for himself, namely, how is it that soul, which is subordinate to God and the angels and is roused to action by them, can still move by and in itself? A good question, you might say. And in fact, Ficino himself said, sic hic oritur dubitatio. Here we've got a problem. So he tries to illustrate the problem by the example of Apelles. Actus, this is the densest philosophical part, I think, of this paper. Actus, act perhaps rather than action, is the immediate impulse to create and is represented in this allegory by the inspiration to paint the field, not the actual movements involved in doing so. It is rather, and here's this passage which I think has been misplaced, it is rather, and I quote from Ficino here, the subsequent act of observing and painting that is called movement, because it takes place gradually. So inspiration is act, but the movements involved in making a picture are movements precisely because they take place gradually. The painter looks first at one flower, then another. It is the meadow that first makes Apelles' soul see it and yearn to paint it. It is Apelles' soul, not the meadow, that makes him look first at one blade of grass, then another, over various moments of time, then the flowers, and then depict them in the same gradual way. This is a complex passage about the relationship between different kinds of movement, or rather a force that arises without movement and movement that expands over time. Yet this is entirely ignored by both Chastel and Gombrich in their desire to relate it to perhaps the greatest crux of Quattrocento iconography. But its similarity to anything in Botticelli, I think, is purely coincidental. Moreover, in the same well-known article in which Gombrich discusses this passage, he is so taken with you'll remember this, with the apparent, some of you, with the apparent relevance of Ficino's letter to Lorenzo di Pier Francesco dei Medici, in which the youth is exhorted to fix his eyes on Venus as a symbol of humanitas, something you can imagine appealing to that particular generation of scholars, that again he misses its first and main point, which is that the protagonist of the passage is not Venus, but Luna. Luna is the protagonist because she controls all the other planets, including Venus, whom he only gets on to much later. The happiest man, says Ficino, is he for whom fate has so disposed the signs that Luna is in favorable aspect to the other planets. So here comes the important bit. For what else can she signify to us, that's Luna, but the continuous motion of the soul and the body? Your Luna, the continuous, he repeats, the continuous motion of your soul and body should avoid the excessive speed of Mars and the tardiness of Saturn. That is, it should leave everything to the right and opportune moment, and should not hasten unduly nor tarry too long, and so on. But of course, there are larger moral issues entailed by movement than a mere exhortation to verecundia, modesty, of the kind we find in contemporary treatises such as Maffeo Veggio's on the education of noble youths. Let me move on to them. In his life of Fra Bartolomeo, Vasari wrote that at this time Fra Geronimo Savonarola, Dominican of Ferrara, was at San Marco, and Baccio became deeply attached to him. In his preaching, Fra Geronimo declared daily that lascivious pictures, music, and amorous books often led men astray, and that he was persuaded that it was not good to have pictures of naked men and women in houses where there are young girls. As always, the concern with the sensuality of painting is aligned with the fundamental corruption or corruptibility of women, just as we find at more or less the same time the Decor, that little treatise, the Decor Puellarum. Vasari continues, The following carnival, it being a custom of the city to make bonfires on the piazzas, accompanied by amorous dances, the men and women taking hands and dancing around them, the people, stirred up by Fra Geronimo, brought numbers of profane paintings and sculptures, many of them the work of great masters, with books, lutes, and collections of love songs to be burned. This was most unfortunate, especially in the case of paintings, for Baccio brought all his studies of the nude, which he then threw on the bonfires, his example being imitated by Lorenzo di Credi and many others who were called piagnoni. The negative association, by the way, between dancing and bad images goes back to the history of the golden calf in Exodus 32. It is vividly illustrated by Filippino's remarkable panel in London, showing the dance around Apis, so as a pagan and suitor, because the Apis appeared in the sky, you see, to the Egyptians, but this is clear conflation. It was a pagan and suitably illusory equivalent of the golden calf, painted at almost exactly the same time, where it is hard to restrain not just the impression, but the actual feeling one has of bodies that are out of control, bodies given over to the sensuality that their extravagant movements make all too clear. But as I already noted, the question of art and morality in the Renaissance would be seriously scanted if it were simply to be thought of in terms of indecorousness or the dangers of bodily arousal through the eyes. In looking more closely at the moral dialectics of movement in Renaissance art, however, it's instructive to begin with a series of paintings associated, not without controversy, with Savonarola and Fra Bartolomeo on the one hand, and Savonarola and Botticelli on the other. Fra Bartolomeo gave up painting for at least 4 years, and the first work he did after returning to it, after being pressed by the prior of San Marco, was the remarkable Vision of St. Bernard. This is around 1500. There is a kind of forward momentum in this work, an impetus towards the figure of the saint in which it is hard not to feel caught up. And that is very different, say, from Filippino's earlier painting of the same subject. Fra Bartolomeo arouses the empathetic involvement of the spectator through the effective representation of movement, and thus gains her or his moral as well as sensory attention, which comes to rest in the still and composed figure of that saint. I quote, rapt, from Vasari, rapt in contemplation, exhibiting an indescribable celestial fervor which illuminates the whole work to the eyes of an attentive beholder. Vasari also reports that after falling under Savonarola's spell, Botticelli abandoned painting and that he would have died penniless had it not been for the help of his friends. He is supposed to have become a piagnone himself, and it is more than likely that the tortured Cioni Pietà, was painted for a member of that group. This is a picture in which the movement matches the willed psychological intensity of the group, in which every trick of bodily knowledge is utilized to engage the empathetic involvement of the spectator in the psychological suffering of Christ and those who assist him. Botticelli's late works are characterized even more than his earlier ones by exceptional kinesthetic energy. I just remind you of a secular work, The Calumny. The figures in them are fraught with powerful movement, their gestures always strikingly clear, often overwrought, as they reach out to convey their strong emotions of intimacy, collapse, flight, and protection. Perhaps the key work in this whole context is the great mystic nativity of 1500. Whoops. Well, there's another one which shows this strong emotions of intimacy, flight, and protection. So the key work in this whole context is the great mystic nativity of 1500 in the National Gallery in London. As is well known, the only way in which the Platonic reservations about imitation were redeemed from the Neoplatonists on through Abbot Suger was by an anagogic view of art, in which light played the central role. Indeed, this brilliantly lit work, with its golden orb above illuminating the rest of the scene, seems to be perfectly associable with the ecstatic proem of the Platonic theology, dedicated to none other than Lorenzo de' Medici himself. I quote, Plato, the father of the philosophers, realizing that our minds bear the same relationship to God as our sight to the light of the sun, and that therefore they can never understand anything without the light of God, therefore when we philosophize about morality, the soul must be purged and thus made serene and calm, so that we might finally perceive the light and worship God. Later on, Ficino records a marvelous phrase that Socrates, as Plato writes, stood motionless in the same spot from one sunrise to another, deep in thought and abstracted from his body. The fact is that this work is a work in which the movement of the angels above and the stillness of the Virgin below play at least as central a role as the shining light that emanates from the radiant sky of this painting. For good reasons that have been much discussed, the work has always been associated with Savonarola, even though in the movements of the angels above we may seem to detect something of the happiness that Vasari said was part of Botticelli's native character and that somehow went astray in the conversion to Savonarolism. That happiness is also what seems to be conveyed by Donatello's putti. The painting is basically tripartite. Above, the graceful round of angels crowned with olive branches join their hands in exactly the way prescribed for the dances, the balli a tondo of the Piagnoni, and dance beneath a fiery celestial radiance, the fire from heaven which Savonarola had preached about a couple of years before. In the center, the Virgin kneels in still and concentrated devotion, while beneath her come the pairs of olive-wreathed men and angels who embrace warmly as the devils are pierced by their own hooks or sink into the pits. I think these are difficult to see. Here's one of the devils sinking into the pit below. There's several further of them being pierced by their own hooks. Once more, the bendings are so extravagant, the gestures throughout so clear, that the actions of all these figures seem to activate a sense of our own bodily potential for movement. How much less effective this all seems in the case of the slightly earlier frescoes by Filippino in the Carafa Chapel in Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. Despite the fact, I think you can see in this overall slide the angels above. We'll have a look at the detail below. Of course, there's the Annunciation, above, the angels around the Assunta here in the center, but still she is, and here an Annunciation below. Despite the fact that Botticelli surely had this work in mind, the reverse of the usual relationship, when he painted the mystic nativity, Filippino was simply less good at the convincing representation of figures in movement. Here they seem to engage us, much less, perhaps, because Filippino was just trying too hard. I think you see the difference in these exaggerated movements of Filippino on the left, and there, for comparison, the top of the mystic nativity on the right. The aim clearly is not dissimilar, but to compare this Virgin, the Virgin below, with that in Botticelli, and these various angels with those in the mystic nativity, is to have a sense of the degree to which the relative ability, whether conscious or unconscious, of the artist to engage a feeling of bodily participation, and through that of the emotions he wants his characters and his work to convey, that we may begin to get a clue to the aesthetic. But this is a topic for another occasion. One of the few Savonarolan passages generally acknowledged to be pertinent to the interpretation of the mystic nativity comes from his sermon on the nativity for Christmas Eve of 1493. Savonarola took as his text Psalm 85, 10 to 11. Mercy and truth are met together, so you see these couplets of embracing figures. Mercy and truth are met together, righteousness and peace have kissed each other, truth shall spring out of the earth, and righteousness shall look down from heaven. The verbs of the psalm itself are full of movement, which I quoted. The text of Savonarola's commentary even more so. E subito veggo discendere dal seno del Padre Eterno una veneranda donna con un ramo d'oliva e veniva cantando misericordia Domini plena est terra, and then it says, justice looked down from heaven and descended into the earth, clamando et cantando gloria in excelsis Deo. And here is the important line, ed ecco dall'altra parte del cielo venne una donna in abito semplice, bianco e puro, bellissima e graziosa, e con impeto grande corse in verso al giustizia. And together they kissed each other, and so they went on. Justice and peace are embraced and kissed each other. All of these iconographic details may not pertain directly to the picture, though many surely do, but the pervasive emphasis on movement does. Perhaps more than in any other painting of Botticelli's, the figures are invested with a sense of graceful but rushing movement, emphasized not only as Alberti required by their flowing draperies, as you see above, but above all the ways in which the figures below rush into each other's arms and warmly embrace. Venne una donna in abito semplice, it reminds you of the figure in the center below, bianco e puro, bellissima e graziosa, e con impeto grande corse in verso al giustizia, ed insieme si baciorno. And so justice and peace kissed each other. So intense do these embraces seem, so patent an illustration of outstretching, that we too seem somehow to strive to imitate these actions, to see if it were indeed possible to lean so far forward, to stretch our arms so far, to push our faces forwards to kiss, in order to embrace the personified virtues we seek. But it's the notion of impetus, con impeto grande corso alla giustizia, that is both verbally and physically central to the understanding of the painting and its implications. In a recent paper, Frank Fehrenbach set out the philosophical context of the term impetus in 13th century Franciscan adaptations of Aristotelian physics. Images would not have their sense of liveliness, the means by which they activate our sensual engagement with them, were they not invested with the impetus that is essential to vitality. This, of course, is why the notion is so critical for Franciscan painting of the 14th century. The power and effect of images depends on their anima, and anima is predicated on movement. Impetus is what gives life to the image, and this life is precisely what constitutes the moral dimension of images, because it implicates our own bodily awareness. All this is in tune with the Platonic and later the Ficinian position on how movement gives life to the body and how this vital activity is performed by the soul. To read Ficino's passages on movement, especially in the Platonic theology, is to have a sense of how profoundly dialectical it is. Every one of them seems to be composed in terms of lyrical antitheses. Perhaps the most remarkable of the chapters in the entire work is the opening of Book 2, in which Ficino discusses the unity and stability of the Godhead and of potency, act, and movement. God is stable and immobile, soul is both moved and moving. Already in Book 1, Ficino had insisted that just as soul is mobile plurality, so God is motionless unity. When we speak of the soul, says Ficino, according to the ancient theologians, we intend the potential of reason. When we speak of nature, we intend the generative force of the soul, and this force, or virtu, is mobile. In a passage that seems to apply almost perfectly to the painting of the mystic nativity, Ficino attaches this clear moral dialectic to the aesthetic. Goodness stands in the center of things. In its orbit is beauty. The unique center of things is God. Around him revolve mind, soul, nature, and material. Since God is at the center in which all things are good, beauty is the ray of light that infuses these four orbits and which paints each of them. In the first circle, Ficino continues in this endless discussion of movement, is the splendor of ideas. In the second, the splendor of reason. In the third, that of seeds. And in the fourth, the splendor of form. To consider Quattrocento painting outside this context is to entirely miss its fundamental psychology, which moves so profoundly from symbolic to moral reasoning, from symbolic representation to the morality of embodied vision. Movement, of course, is also central to the virtù of the Divine Comedy, the illustration of which occupied so much of Botticelli's time in the years before Savonarola. In Purgatorio, in the second canto of Purgatorio, when Dante and Virgil emerge from the terrors of hell and are overwhelmed by the loveliness of earth, sea, and sky, they stand transfixed, noi eravam tutti fissi, as they listen to the sweet song of Casella. But then suddenly Cato, il veglio onesto, intervenes, gridando, che ciò spiriti lenti, qual negligenza, quale stare è questo, correte al monte, move, he says, and strip yourselves of the slough that does not allow you to see God himself. So I hope you can see, here's Cato in the second canto, telling the lenti, the spiritu lenti, to move along. Movement invests what is immobile with liveliness and thereby endows it with its sensuality. It supplies the image with soul, it is the manifestation of soul, but at the same time it is what enables the image to manifest its potential carnality. In this lies the premium on stability and serenity exemplified in Fra Bartolomeo's vision of St. Bernard and in the still and crucial center of the mystic nativity here, where the Virgin kneels in adoration of the child. Her eyes significantly are closed, for if she opened them, she would see and be engaged by all the flowing movement around her and above her. To see her here is to be reminded of Ficino's description of Socrates' stillness. In the end, it is in Dante that the moral dimensions of movement are clearest. I don't mean the obvious antithesis of up and down, but something more than that. For Dante, the whole of human existence is a pilgrimage of forward movement. It is the sinners who cannot move from where they are, since they are stuck in ice. Non troverai ombra degna più d'esser fitta in gelatina, he writes in the canto, stuck in gelatin, in the canto devoted to those who betray family and country. So these amazing, you'll remember this here, the illustration for Inferno 32. You can see, I think, how they are here, these legs stuck there, and here they're all tied down in the most contorted poses. Here, actually, in an earlier scene of Simoniacs, perhaps it's even clearer. You see here, they're really stuck. While there's little movement in the pit of hell, as you know, in paradise, movement is energy, virtue, and happiness, right through its climactic association with love. Come rota che egualmente è mossa, l'amor che muove il sole e le altre stelle. On page after page, Botticelli's illustrations for the Divine Comedy offer testimony to this, in ways that directly engage both the represented and the viewing body. There is always an exiting to the better and more flourishing world, vivified, as you see here, by the flames and flowers of virtue. Noi siamo usciti fuori del maggior corpo al ciel che è pura luce. This is the old anagogic view in Paradiso 38 to 39. Di tal fiumana uscian faville vive, e di ogni parte se mettean nei fiori. So you see here these vive faville coming out and turning into flowers. And they return to the river, e se una entrava, un'altra ne uscia fuori. Anagogy is not only light, it is light plus movement, and nowhere more than in Dante. At this point, we can return to the mystic nativity. In looking at the angels dancing in a ring above, it is impossible not to recall, and I quote from Paradiso, second canto, the movement, it's impossible not to recall the movement and the virtue of the sacred circlings, lo moto e la virtude santi giri, which just as the smith, this is an important metaphor, which just as the smith imparts the hammer's art, must be inspired by blessed movers, and so from the deep mind that makes it wheel, the sphere that many lights adorn receives that stamp of which it then becomes the seal. And this image, that of the hammer of the smith being operated by another superior agent, is one that Savonarola exploited quite directly in a sermon in which the basic morality of movement is spelled out more clearly, I think, than anywhere else, and which is fundamental for our understanding of this painting. In Sermon 44 on Good Friday 1496, he preached that the philosophers say that every movement under the heavens depends entirely on the movement of the heavens, such that if the movement of the heavens were to cease, every other motion of the world would cease. Thus they say that the movement of the heavens is the life of all natural things, exactly like Ficino. If the heavens are moved, then they must of necessity be moved by another mover. Therefore the heavens are the instrument of another agent, quia omne quod movetur ab altero movetur. Since the heavens cannot operate except through motion, it is a sign that they are an instrument, and here is the same image again, as are the saw, the hammer, and the file, which cannot operate on their own if they are not moved by the same principal agent. In the same way, the heavens are an instrument which operates because it has been moved by another. For this reason, some say that this is the soul of the heavens, anima del cielo, and thus that the heavens are animated. This is the position, of course, of Savonarola's great foe, Ficino, and both, of course, concur that only God, the primum mobile, is necessarily immobile. But let's return to the graceful angels who animate this painting by circling that divine radiance in the center above them. Their movements are indicated, as recommended by Alberti and described by Ovid, by fluttering drapes and hair blown in the breeze. Here it's very hard to follow Kenneth Clark in his book on the Dante illustrations when he describes the angels in one of his all too characteristic off-the-mark comments as thin, scrawny, unseductive creatures, which, spiritually beautiful as they are, this is Kenneth Clark, bear no resemblance to the physically prosperous angels with their billowing drapery who surround Dante and Beatrice in paradise. Well, that's pushing a comparison, I think. For do not these figures recall, I'm asking, do not these figures recall the image of the souls in heaven who revolve as the wheels within clockwork, so that to one who observes the first seems quiet and the last to fly? So did those circles, differently dancing, give me the measure of their riches, all joining in the round, some fast, some slow. Even more specifically, perhaps, in Paradiso 23, the angel Gabriel, to show you this again, speaks in terms that surely inspired this work. I am angelic love who circles that high gladness that breathes out from the womb that was the dwelling place of our desire. So shall I circle, Lady of Heaven, until you follow your Son and make still more divine the supreme sphere because you enter it. Thus the circling melody sealed itself, and all the other lights sounded the name of Mary. Of course, there, right in the center, is the still God, as we've been discussing. In all of this, as you may have noticed, the question of the relationship between dance and the felt imitation of movement comes to the fore, because it contains within it, it seems to me, the nucleus of the problem of the relationship between movement and morality. In the Florentine Intermezzi of 1589, which formed the basis of Warburg's understanding of the pathos formal, as well as his reformulations of the tension between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the first intermedio is not devoted to any struggle, as it would later on, but rather to the harmony of the universe as personified by the Harmonia Doria, the Dorian mode, not the frenzied other modes, but rather that most grave, temperate, and decorous of modes, the supreme form of music for that very reason. It's strange, as I've written elsewhere, that in his now even more famous study of the Pueblo dances, which were inspired by the Intermezzi, Warburg failed to see the stillness of those Pueblo dances, which he insisted were frenzied. Just such a dichotomy is implicit in the Savonarolan positions on dance. On the one hand, he condemned dance for its vain excitements. On the other, he encouraged the Piagnoni to join hands in the staid ballo a tondo, the circular dance that was generally done to the accompaniment of their hallmark verse from Psalm 132, "Behold how good and pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity." The singing and dancing were supposed to give the Piagnoni a kind of preview of the millennium, when their church would be renovated, fraternal love would prevail, and Christ would reign on earth. All this, of course, is perfectly consistent with the ancient view of the circular dance of the graces as testimony to the harmony by which love orders the universe. Savonarola often preached sermons on this psalm, Psalm 132. And he did so no fewer than 11 times in the space of less than a month, even after his excommunication in 1498. Excuse me. In one of the Laude, later composed on this psalm, at the end of the procession in search of Jesus, his followers see the Virgin in heaven, the angel legions, and of course Savonarola with his two companions. And then they dance a ballo a tondo, hearts aflame with joy, in a version of the millenarian visions of Savonarola himself. It is this too, of course, that informs the painting of the mystic Nativity, painted in 1500, as the much-commented inscription tells us. I, Sandro, made this picture at the conclusion of the year 1500 in the troubles of Italy, in the half-time, after the time, according to the 11th chapter of St. John, in the second woe of the apocalypse, during the loosing of the devil for 3.5 years. Then he will be chained in the 12th, and we shall see him buried or trampled. It's right at the bottom, which unfortunately you probably can't see, as in this picture. These little devils here, there, some buried or trampled by the Pax et Justitia, embracing themselves. In the end, morality is implicit in the movements of every dance. Negatively viewed movements of the body are a frequent target of criticism in the Renaissance, as much as in many other periods. But at the same time, they could also be the perfect expressions of harmony, grace, community, and spiritual love. The same tension, as Nikolai Rubinstein pointed out years ago, occurs in Lorenzetti's Buon Governo in Siena, where despite the fact that dancing in the streets was illegal, his allegorical female dancers stood for civic harmony. Michael Baxendall already noted how Alberti's treatise on painting and Guglielmo Ebreo's treatise on dance shared a preoccupation with physical movements as a reflex of mental movements. According to Guglielmo Ebreo, the slow and measured bassa danza reveals spiritual movements on the outside which must be made to tally with the measured and perfect consonances of that harmony which by our hearing descends to our intellectual parts. All the more reason, therefore, as Pierluigi Vecchi recently noted, that a fundamental requirement of the bassa danza, in contrast to dances of a popular character, was to avoid excessive and extreme movements. I quote, "And it remains that this agility and manner should in no way be used for extremes, but your movement should be kept in moderation, so that there is neither too much nor too little, but much gentleness," wrote Domenico da Piacenza in his De Arte Saltandi et Choreas Ducendi. The movement of the body, as Vecchi comments, took on connotations of an ethical and social nature in accordance with a precise code of conduct, just as I mentioned before in the case of Veggio's De Liberorum Educatione. The issue of decorum and propriety, and in particular of the need for moderation in movement, returns often enough. But it is not this that endows movement with its full moral dimension. Painting as an art is a moral activity. It evokes the body through its capacity to engender a sense of movement. Movement, as Ficino and the artists I've cited today make so clear, is fraught with dichotomy. On the one hand, it is associated with the joy of ascent. On the other, it is the opposite of serenity, stability, and fixity. On the one hand, sinners are stuck. On the other, they are animated by the very movements that engender their all too earthbound carnality. Both generation and corruption are affected through motion. Stability serves the present good, Movement drives us to seek good in the future. God, bontà, and bellezza combined is the divine still center, but humans are constantly impelled to move closer to him. It is in the evocation of the body that the moral dimension of the imitative arts emerge most clearly. For at this point, the dichotomies of movement are no longer abstract, they are felt. This is the lesson to be learned from responses to Renaissance painting, perhaps from all painting. It makes plain that the dichotomies I have mentioned today are implicit in the bodily matrix of the soul. A unique vision of morality destroys morality because it takes away the possibility of choice. So to see the question of the morality of the visual arts simply in terms of sensuality and the concomitant need for decorum is to scant the problem by more than half. It is too easy. For in what does the question of morality lie, if not in the question of choice? Thank you. So I've been told that we should have some questions. I realize that most of you have heard many lectures today and have asked many questions, but I'll follow instructions. I've also responded by saying we shouldn't have too many questions, but does anybody want to comment? In fact, I'd prefer comments than questions because I suspect you all have something to add.
Hello, is this on? Hi. Thank you for an extraordinary talk. I'm over here.
Oh, there, good.
Sorry.
I put on my glasses.
Yeah, that was remarkable. I especially was struck by the passing implication you made that the implications of pneumatic physiology and contemporary neuroscience somehow coincide. I thought that was remarkable. But the question I had was about something you said when you were talking about the images that don't seem to work because they seem to be trying too hard. And you moved in the course of maybe a minute or two in the talk from talking about extravagant movement, which activates our own bodily potential for movement, and then you talked about exaggerated movement, which doesn't, and which fails to do that. So my question's about the difference. When does the extravagant become the exaggerated? Because if it needs to be extravagant in order to work, then it can't, then presumably the kind of movement you're talking about that does kind of invoke our own bodily potential can't just be the simple representation of action. There has to be something extra mimetic about it. When does that blend into the exaggerated? When does it stop working?
You know, I don't know how to answer that question. I hope I didn't give the impression that, I didn't intend to give the impression that movements to evoke responses need to be exaggerated, because clearly in the case of Botticelli, we have a greater sense of engagement because to us these figures seem to be the movements seem exaggerated. I think prima facie this seems to be the case. My claim was really not, and then I said, you know, that it seems to go too far in the case of Filippino. What I really was trying to suggest here was not something subjective, but something objective. In other words, that it's in the artist's ability to evoke a sense of felt imitation that we may gain some measure of whatever it is that we call the aesthetic. I wouldn't know how to establish a cutoff point between effectiveness and exaggeratedness. My suspicion, and that's because I'm influenced by my work with physiologists of movement, my suspicion is that it actually requires much less than we think to arouse a sense of felt imitative movements. So that's the sort of modern view. But even in the case of these claims for Botticelli, I think, you know, what is happening is that Botticelli is so aware of the contemporary discussions of movement, which, as I suggested, have fallen out of the discussion on of his iconography. He's so aware of these contemporary discussions, of the positive and negative aspects of movement, that they have much to do with the direction of his concerns with the movements of bodies in paintings. But I wouldn't try to establish a cutoff point between what is exaggerated and what is effective. I think Andre here. Sorry.
I mean, since you're talking about a kind of identification with bodily activity, I sort of wonder about the issue of scale, which you don't seem to bring. You didn't bring that in, because the examples you focus on are actually involving very small scale figures, notwithstanding the PowerPoint presentation, you know? So how do you, you know, if you think of those drawings, and even this painting, the figures are very small, really. I think that's a problem in a way in terms of the issue of that kind of visceral identification.
No, I think that the issue of scale is a very large one, but in a way the question here is, the question is neurophysiological again. I mean, I wish I were giving a talk about my work with neuroscientists, but this is not something that has been studied. Prima facie, again, it would seem that the larger the figures, the easier it is to become involved. But I think here we have to think about artists' own intentions, that word which was so unfashionable for a while. I think when they paint their figures, the idea I'm suggesting is to engage a bodily sense on the part of the beholder, consciously or unconsciously. I mean, after all, artists pay attention to the expression of the emotions through movement, even in stained glass, which we can barely see. But there's no doubt, I think, I'm not sure, but I think that the larger the scale, the more immediate the effect. I agree, but you know, the Dante illustrations are so consonant with with Dante's own views about movement that I thought it impossible not to show them in this context. But scale is a big issue, unquestionably.
Excuse me, yes. Because you have an interest in cognitive science, I was going to bring up something from the field of linguistics. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm over here. Something from some recent work in linguistics. There is now an emerging field known as the evolution of language, in which some of the most recent work in linguists has been now paying more attention to animal language studies and this sort of thing. And if we can change your term, the term motion to the term gesture, this new work in linguistics suggests that gesture is part of the suite of language, and in fact that they evolved evolved in tangent with one another. I mean, excuse me, together with one another. And I'm wondering if, in that sense, you can begin to talk about the issue of movement in painting as a kind of language, or as a kind of proto-language, or even a kind of, I don't know, para-language, or something like that. Yes. And since you do work in cognitive science, I bring this up. Otherwise, because I know nothing about art history.
Let me be, thank you for that. Let me be very brief about this. I don't mean to be severe, but I'm going to sound it. And that is, I'm very aware of current work, because anyone who has been concerned, if you're not an art historian, you may not, anyone who's been concerned with the history of art has become more and more and more engaged with the question of gesture and the meanings of gesture. It's something which occupies me, and I've noticed, I know the work tying gestures to questions about the origins of language. I have spent a lot of my life trying to separate visual things from textual, or not from language, in the sense that, you know, we suffered, I think, those of us who were concerned with visual things, I have to remember there's a broad church here. Those of us who were concerned with visual things suffered a long time from the bane of, or from the hegemony of semiotics, in which we used verbs like reading for the way in which we engage with pictures. So in a way, I think it's interesting, that work that is being done on the relationship between a restricted range of gestures, or the notion that we have natural gestures and the beginnings of language. But I prefer to keep it away from the analysis of pictures, because I think that the ways in which we engage with pictures are very different from the ways in which we engage with texts. So.
Your talk was of deep insight, in my view, and special observations, for example, that the exaltated movement of Lippi is not as strong in motivating movement as in the silent movement of Botticelli, for example. And the ground argumentation I have the greatest sympathy of. Saying that, I once again would try to expose that the concept to connect Ficino with Botticelli is wrong-guided. I have brought forward that many times. Many object this. Some people in the room agree, but most of them reject what I have tried to show, that Gombrich's great article was false-guided in the connection of Botticelli and Ficino. And I say this not to bring my argument forward, but only because of the reason that the alternative gives a much stronger support for your argument. It is not that the rereading of Ficino is most compelling. I think it is a reopening of Ficino. But what is Neoplatonic in it? Marullo, the house Marullo, Michele Marullo, the house philosopher of the one who commissioned the Primavera, was an adorer of Lucretius. When he drowned in the river, he had Lucretius de rerum natura below his clothes. Epicurus, the Epicurean and Lucretian theory of gaze and light comes much closer, in my view, to the reflection of movement that is motivated by pictures and objects, because there is a tactile connection between the image and the body. So, as I said, I only bring this forward not to once again propose an alternative to Ficino, but because it comes much closer, fits much closer into your frame of argumentation.
Thank you. This is Horst Bredekamp reminding me of his own rejection of Ficino's, of the Ficinian approach to Botticelli. But I take that, Horst, as a supplementation of my position rather than as a, as a critique. I mean, that we can spend a lot of time discussing Lucretius and Botticelli, of course. This is also a much discussed topic. I mean, I really wanted to talk about movement, and I really wanted to suggest that the ways in which we look at Botticelli exemplify the tension of which I was spoken. I take your point, however, I take as the chief supplementation you are suggesting is to the addition. I slightly moved away from the metaphor of light as a key to interpreting this work. This was a side aspect of my talk, but I take very seriously your return to the relationship between light and the haptic and the optic, if you like. So thank you for that addition, Horst. I appreciate it.
Let's move the discussion with David into the reception. Remember, all the rooms of the galleries of the museum are open. Please enjoy them. And meanwhile, thank you very much to David Freedberg for a magnificent lecture. Thank you.